So I present arguments against all these options. And so this is one way in which I argue for my view that intentionality is impossible because all possible options for it fail.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Amir Horowitz. He is head of the PPE program and professor at the Open University of Israel. His work covers a range of topics, but especially the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and language. He has many published articles on these topics and more. And our interview today will be about his recent book, Intentionality Deconstructed and Anti-Realist Theory. Or will it? I guess maybe it won't be about that, I guess. We'll see. But anyway, feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Horowitz.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to give just a brief overview of before we get into some of the details, what this book is about, no pun intended again, what people might expect to gain from it, who might be interested in that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's tricky because I want to say it's about intentionality, but the main idea is that there isn't any such thing as intentionality. That is, it is a sort of what is sometimes called eliminativist position that I defend there. It's quite in one sense, it's quite, or more than one sense actually, it's quite a radical eliminativist view, because according to it, not only that there are no intentional states and intentional properties, but there cannot be ones. That is, the very idea of intentionality is flawed. The very concept of intentionality is a flawed concept. I present various arguments to this effect. Maybe I'll expend some time later about them. And it is radical also in the sense that it denies intentionality from actually everything. That is from mental states, first of all, but also from linguistic acts. Sometimes people attribute intentionality to computers, to robots, etc. These things also lack intentionality according to my view. It is less radical than other eliminativist views because it does not deny there being mental states. I think there are good reasons to accept there being mental states, and with most of the properties that we standardly attribute to them, absent intentional properties. So it's sort of a partial eliminativist view. Also, unlike people like Paul Churchland or Steve Stitch, my view does not repudiate the so-called intentional stance. That is, I don't recommend against using intentional idioms, against attributing contents to people, either in everyday talk nor in cognitive science. That is, my view is not methodological. It's a conceptual view, a metaphysical view, but it's not a methodological scientific one. That's it for start, I guess.
Yeah, very good. And one point you brought up there is, in the book you use the distinction between intentional irrealism and intentional anti-realism, right?
Yes.
Anti-realism is a stronger view, which you defend, that not only aren't there any intentional properties, there can't even be any. The very notion is flawed, as you say.
Yes. So it is flawed. The concept of intentionality is flawed. And in this respect, it resembles other concepts that we tend to use frequently, standardly, and that seems to be perfectly lucid and coherent, but that upon philosophical reflection, or so it was argued, lack clear sense, lack integrity. The concept of self is taken to be such, the concept of substance and other ones as well. So I take it that the concept of intentionality is similar to these ones. In this sense, it is flawed. It cannot have a clear sense. This is what I'm trying to establish in my book.
Right. Good. And although importantly, you make a distinction between, well, you bring up the notion of concrete intentionality, and that's what you're focusing on. Right? So you don't necessarily want to rule out that maybe abstract things could be about things. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, the importance of it being concrete.
Yeah, a concrete intentionality is the supposed intentionality of concrete states, events, entities in general. That is, I argue that no states, no actual states or possible ones have intentional properties. There is the notion of a proposition or the notion of a concept. I mean, the abstract notion of content, contrast to the psychological one. And I don't deal with these entities, propositions or concepts in this sense. Propositions are said to be intentional by definition. The very idea of a proposition is of something that is about certain things, certain events, etc. So for me, the question regarding propositions is whether there are such things. I mean, once you admit that there are propositions, you thereby admit that there is intentionality. But I don't deny this. I have no strong opinion about whether there are propositions. Anyway, it is irrelevant to my view, which is about the intentionality of mental states, of linguistic acts, etc., not of abstract entities.
Right. I mean, you might be critical of the existence of abstract propositions or anything like that as well, but it's not your focus here, as you say. Rather, we don't. Our various mental attitudes, states, and so on, they lack intentional properties, and at least in the realist sense that you discussed, according to your view. And other things that we might say have intentionality, or maybe sort of derived intentionality, don't have it either. But maybe we can talk about derived intentionality as well, like books or pictures or movies or maps, whatever. And as you say, that's to most people going to seem like a rather radical view, although we'll get to some of the critiques and your responses to them later. I did want to ask, because it's sort of important to understand, well, if we're going to say that there is no intentionality or there are no intentional properties, what is it exactly that we're denying? We have to understand what it's supposed to be, or what would have to be the case for there to be intentionality in this respect, in order to deny that there are any such things. I wonder, and I remember a few of the things you talk about, like how it has to be at least weakly relational and so on. But maybe if you could talk a little bit about what would have to be the case, at least very minimally, for there to be intentionality in the respect you reject.
Well, intentionality is supposed to be, is sometimes referred to as aboutness. That is, things that are intentional are about things, typically about other things. Or in other words, they are supposed to represent other things. My belief that dogs are faster than cats, for example, is a belief about dogs, about cats, about the presumed fact that dogs are faster than cats, etc. Other synonyms for intentionality is reference. Reference is usually used in the context of language. Linguistic entities are supposed to refer, words are supposed to refer to objects in the world. Actually, it's the same thing. It's the same relation. That is, for a word to refer to something is the same as for a mental state to be about it, to have intentionality, to be directed, as it were, upon this object. These are all synonyms: reference, intentionality. Other things are content or meaning. There is some difference between intentionality and content. Perhaps we'll get into it later, but they're very close. So the basic idea is that our mental states are supposed to represent things in the world, typically in the non-mental world, that is, the mind represents or is directed at objects or states of affairs. Like, I believe that the sun is shining, so my belief is about the sun and the fact that it is shining, if it is a fact, etc. This is the basic idea. Now, you ask what has to be the case for there to be intentionality. Well, again, this is a tricky question for me because my view is a conceptual view. So I think that the condition, there are no coherent conditions for the instantiation of the concept of intentionality. But I examine certain options that may give substance, that may give sense to the idea of intentionality, and I reject them all. That is, I attempt to reject all options in logical space regarding intentionality. One of them is that intentionality is a primitive phenomenon. It's simply a brute fact that our mental states have intentionality, a state that, like other primitive states, like other primitive facts, needs no explanation. So I reject this option, and then there are the reductive options. And there are few kinds of reductions of intentionality. I divide them basically into two kinds, what I refer to as intrinsic reduction and extrinsic reduction. Well, intrinsic reduction, the prominent example of intrinsic reduction in current philosophy of mind is the phenomenal intentionality view, according to which intentionality is reduced to consciousness, to phenomenal consciousness. And the idea of extrinsic reduction is the idea that intentionality, the intentional relation, the relation of representing things in the world, can be reduced to some naturalistic relation, that is, relation of the kind that is referred to in the physical sciences, a sort of causal relation. That is, if I think about some object X, it must be the case that there is some causal connection of some specific sort between my thought and this object, or some biological function that relates me to this object, etc. So I present arguments against all these options. And so this is one way in which I argue for my view, that is, intentionality is impossible because all possible options for it fail. And now there are various kinds of reductive views, naturalistic reductive views, as I mentioned, the causal options, the biological ones, the informational ones, etc. And there are various critiques against them. And it proved not to be a very simple task to construct such a theory, but my argument, since I aspire to rule out the very possibility of intentionality, my arguments are not about specific examples of such theories, but against the very idea of them, against the very idea of reductive naturalistic theories, against the very idea of intrinsic reductions, etc.
All right, good. So maybe we can look sort of briefly at some of the issues for the three kind of general options here: primitivism, intrinsic reduction, and extrinsic reduction. Regarding a primitivist view, I mean, maybe with someone could say something like, "Look, I mean, on the proposition abstract object view, where propositions are just like about things. There's just no further story to be told there. It's a sort of primitivist view. It's just some sort of brute fact that they're about things. That's perhaps intelligible. Why couldn't that be true for concrete things? They're just about things, and there's like maybe nothing more to say about what makes it the case that that's so. Okay. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, that brings us to the what is called the question of intentionality. Well, I can say a few more words about intentionality from another direction. We describe mental states, both of ourselves and of other people. We typically describe them in terms of objects in the non-mental world. That is, we describe and characterize entities of one category, mental ones, beliefs, desire, etc., in terms of entities of another category, another metaphysical category, for example, like houses, dogs, cats, things in the non-mental world. That is, we describe the mental in terms of the non-mental, in terms of worldly facts. And the question of intentionality is what on earth justifies us in attaching to our mental states these properties. Okay? My belief is most probably in my head, in my brain. Cats and dogs are out there. So what the hell is the relation between my belief and the dogs out there that makes it a belief about dogs? This is the question of intentionality. As I said, it proved to be a very difficult question. Russell thought the intentional relation is a mysterious one. Kant took this question to be the most difficult metaphysical question. And now you can say, well, why can't it be a primitive relation? I mean, there are primitive facts, after all, because reductions cannot go on ad infinitum. We must stop at some point. But intentionality, assuming intentionality, cannot be such a point. It cannot be because there is the well-known phenomena of intentional inexistence. That is, we think of things that do not exist. We think of Santa Claus. We philosophers are fond of thinking and speaking about unicorns, etc. And we cannot give sense in a primitivist way to this idea, because when the object of my mental state does not exist, what can I say about my relation to it? Actually nothing. So this is the basic idea of my argument against primitivism. I'm not sure it works. That is, more precisely, in the final analysis, I would say it doesn't work also for the case of existing intentional objects. But the way to see this goes to showing that it cannot work for non-existing intentional objects. You cannot characterize this relation in this case. You cannot see, I just think of it. You think of what? What is true of your state that is supposed to be directed at a non-existent object? Nothing can be said about it. So this is the basic idea why primitivism and intentionality cannot work.
Right. Yeah. So what if someone were to say, well, what if someone were to just reject sort of this requirement that in all cases, your thoughts, in order to be about things, have to actually satisfy some robust relation? Like there has to be a relata, on either side.
Yeah.
On one side, there's the belief or whatever, and on the other side, there's an object or non-existent object or mental object or something. Maybe we just deny that that's the right way to think about intentionality in general. I mean, maybe in some cases that's the right way to think about it, but I don't know. What do you think about the approach which rejects the relationality in the strong sense? Or I guess it's a weak sense as well. But anyway, what do you think?
First of all, my point is not that there must be relata in general, but that primitivism requires that there be intentional relata.
Right.
Okay? Perhaps reductive theories, causal theories can account for the cases of non-existent intentional object, but not primitivism. Okay? Now, regarding the very requirement of relationality, I think that if you give up this requirement, you are left with no intentionality at all. That is, intentionality is directedness. Now, there can be relations. Relation in the strong sense is a relation like being the father of Dan. For one to be the father of Dan, one has to exist and Dan has to exist. Okay? That's fine. I don't require this from intentionality because there are relations in a weaker sense. For example, being soluble in water. For an object, for a substance to be soluble in water, there need not be water. It's a disposition, the dispositional property. That means that if this material would be put in water, water is defined as so and so, such and such, in terms of such and such chemical structure, then it would dissolve. Okay? Water does not have to exist. So intentionality can be said to be relational in this sense. Okay? And in this way, we can, in principle, perhaps account for the case of non-existent intentional objects. We think of things that do not exist. We maintain relations of the weak kind to these things, that if there were such things, etc. But my point about primitivism was that in this case, you cannot make sense of this relation, because unless you reduce this relation, you translate it in terms of some properties, of some requirements that the thing has to maintain in order to be referred to by mental states, you can say nothing of this weak relation. And the idea of weak intentional relation can be put in terms of satisfiability. That is, an intentional state is satisfiable. It need not be actually satisfied by an object. But for the very idea of satisfiability to make sense, then the idea of actually satisfying an intentional state, of actual reference, has to make sense. And why a relation in the strong sense entered the scene as well, and I argue that we cannot make sense of it. And why we cannot make sense of it, this goes into the heart of the arguments against reductive and naturalistic theories, against phenomenal intentional theories, and so on.
Right. And so then for phenomenal intentionality as a candidate for intrinsic reduction, so on this view, the idea would be, look, that we have phenomenal states, feelings, perceptions, so on, and some of those, and in some views, all of those, have a kind of intrinsic intentional character. They just have these properties in themselves, and that's how we reduce the intentionality. They're reduced to these characters of these phenomenal states. So that's the rough idea. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to introduce that a bit more and talk about maybe some of the potential issues with that view of intentionality.
Yes. This view, in fact, reduces intentionality to phenomenal consciousness. This is to the famous what it's like aspect of conscious states. For me, very generally, this idea seems strange because intentionality is directed outside, to go from the mind to the world, whereas phenomenal consciousness is an internal characteristic of mental states. And I don't see I use the term the transcending nature of intentionality, the fact that it directs us outside. I don't see how phenomenal consciousness can help us with this task of explaining this relation outside, because it is, as I said, it is internal element. Okay, this is the basic idea behind all my arguments against phenomenal intentionality. I can get into the details if you'd like, but maybe later, whatever. But this is the basic problem that I found initially with the very idea of reducing intentionality to phenomenality. And I think arguments can show that this conviction can be indeed established. Yep.
Right. So the basic worry there is that, look, if it's intrinsic reduction here, all we have to appeal to in the reduction base, so to speak, is stuff in terms of, well, stuff going on in our heads, the intention, the phenomenal consciousness, and so on. But what's supposed to be reduced is supposed to involve, it's supposed to transcend that in a way. It's supposed to reach out into the world, perhaps, or at least potentially reach out into the world. And it doesn't seem like we have the tools to, in the base, right, to reduce, to explain that sort of phenomenon. Is that sort of the basic idea that you're getting at there?
The basic idea is that these two characteristics of mental states, intentionality on the one hand, and phenomenality, phenomenal consciousness on the other hand, they are very different. And phenomenality does not have the resources in it in order to take us out of our skins, as it were. Yep. Because intentionality can be resembled to an arrow that points out from the mind outside. Nothing in phenomenality has the ability to do this, to direct us outside. Yep. It is a very, what it's like aspect is how I experience from within my mental states, qualities of mental states. Yeah? From within, they have no connection whatsoever to what goes on outside. Okay, this is the very idea. A sharp distinction between intentionality and consciousness. One is outward looking, the other is inward looking. So I take them to be separate, and this no bridge can connect them.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because that's potentially a controversial view. I mean, there's even some like strong forms of, you discussed representationalism a bit in the view, but in the book, but there's some strong forms of representationalism according to which, well, the phenomenal character is, I may not be getting this exactly right, but it's sort of like exhausted really by the intentional features of those states, or at least that's a essential component to them. So, I mean, I take it, of course, you reject these sorts of very strong representationalist views. I mean, but what do you think about that? That someone were to just say, no, it's not really a bridge here to gap. Like this is just a key aspect, or perhaps even the kind of only aspect, in one sense, of these states. What do you think about that? Is that worth taking seriously, or?
Yeah. First of all, representationalism. I mean, representationalism is this term has various meanings in philosophy. The one that relates to the intentionality consciousness relations is the view that phenomenality is reducible to intentionality. Okay, I tend to think that this view is wrong, but my interest lies in the other direction, because I want to deny intentionality. So the question for me is whether intentionality can be reduced to phenomenality. Now, on the face of it, suppose there is intentionality, there are intentional states, then there's no problem for these two properties, intentionality and phenomenal consciousness, to coexist. Yep. But the problem is not that of their coexistence, but of explaining the one in terms of the other. And due to the gap that I mentioned that exists between them, I think this can't work. Okay, so yeah, consciousness is one aspect of mental states that are supposed to be intentional. Yes, it is. Can it account for the other aspect, for intentionality? No.
Right. And I think I recall you making this point, which is that if we want to reduce phenomenality to intentionality, well, okay, but then we're not reducing intentionality to phenomenality, right? Because we can't have the reduction go both ways, so to speak.
Yep.
Is that right? So that would just be to do away with the approach under consideration, the phenomenal reduction, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. I guess we'll talk a bit more about introspection and intuition in a little bit, but at this point, maybe I'll just present one, because it's maybe a common expression or a common response to this sort of view would be say something. Wait a minute, I just know that sometimes my feelings or my beliefs and so on are about things like I get hit in the leg, say, and I just can feel that pain I have is in some way about my leg, right? And we can introspect on the phenomenal experiences that we have and see that they're about things in that way. I mean, what do you think about that sort of response, right, or intuition that people sometimes have?
Yeah. This is intuition of many people, indeed, and many philosophers also adopt this view and try to defend it. I mean, it's a traditional view of philosophers, goes back at least to Descartes, I think, that mentality is transparent to us, in the sense that if you have a mental state, that then you know that you have it, or at least you can know that you have it. And the other way around goes as well. That is, if you have a belief about your own mental state, a belief that is acquired, as it were, directly, not that someone, your shrink or whatever, tells you about your mental state. If you have a direct belief about it, then it exists, and it exists in the way that you take it to exist. Now, nowadays, it is not as acceptable as it used to be, but still many people, many philosophers accept this idea. I don't deny this idea entirely, but I deny that it applies to intentionality. That is, introspection is no good indication for the existence of intentional states, or the nature of would-be intentional states, precisely because of that transcending nature of intentional states. That is, intentionality is not what's here inside our heads. Intentionality is the relation between what's in our heads and the external world. But since it is such a relation, and it is not what's in there, so introspection cannot attest for the assumption that we have such states. Introspection, I assume, is quite a reliable indicator for phenomenality, for the fact that, as you mentioned, I feel a pain in my leg or something like this. That's fine. I mean, let's leave the leg aside for the fact that I have a feeling of pain in my leg, etc. Even this is complicated because perhaps it assumes intentionality, but let's leave it. But to assume that my introspection, that I have a belief about cats and dogs, etc., can be trusted, this, I take, is a mistake. It cannot be a reliable indicator for the existence of beliefs in the sense of there are dogs out there and I think of them, because then it assumes the existence of dogs. And introspection, of course, these are, of course, beyond the jurisdiction of introspection. But even regarding the very directedness outside, intentionality is not a good indicator, because even if you think about, let's say, a doggish belief, the belief about dogs, which need not necessarily exist, still such a belief assume external properties, non-mental properties. And this is already some direction outside of our mind. And for this very reason, introspection is irrelevant. So we cannot trust what introspection says about intentional states. So we should discard this idea. And importantly enough, I think once this idea is put aside, the idea that introspection is a reliable indicator for intentionality, then the whole discussion takes another form. Because if introspection is irrelevant, that is, direct evidence for the existence of intentional states is irrelevant, then the issue becomes an issue of theoretical considerations, that is, as opposed to direct evidence. And once it becomes an issue of theoretical considerations, then it is not such a scandal to assume that intentionality does not exist. Yep, we don't have such strong evidence. Wow, how can it be? I feel that I have such states. Well, maybe you feel, but this feeling is irrelevant to the truth of your feeling.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff there. I wonder, so if someone were to say, okay, it's true, Grant, that we could have, these introspections or intuitions or whatever, even if it turns out that there were no intentional properties. But that seems sort of parallel to some skeptical argument. Like someone could say the same thing. Oh, look, you could have the same experiences and intuitions and so on, even if there were no external world. So we shouldn't take those intuitions or introspections as any motivation for thinking that there's an external world. And, maybe these aren't exactly parallel, but I could see someone saying something like, the fact that these are compatible with the absence of the phenomenon in question doesn't really undermine, really, my motivation for thinking that those things exist on the basis of these intuitions or introspections. So, because otherwise, it's just a sort of skeptical argument that could lead us to reject so many things that we don't want to reject. Maybe I'm not being super clear, but I mean, what do you think about the charge that, the worry or the response you're giving is sort of kind of like a skeptical argument or a skeptical response that maybe a lot of people wouldn't sign on to?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand, but let me try, and please correct me if I misunderstood you. First of all, as a psychological fact, of course, our non-reflective belief about there being intentionality is not going to be shaken neither by showing that introspection is irrelevant to the existence of these states, nor by showing even that this phenomenon does not exist, by providing direct arguments against the existence of intentionality. As a daily matter, we ascribed even intentional anti-realist like myself do ascribe contents to ourselves and to our fellow subjects, certainly. Why this happens, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a full answer, but from one perspective, we are immersed in a practice of content descriptions, and since we are immersed in such a practice, we don't notice it. And so we take it that our ascriptions of content, as it were, objective. We even argue about them. I mean, philosophers argue about whether a certain expression refers to a certain object or not. The fact that we are arguing about them show that we take these ascriptions to have truth values. Take ours to be true, our opponents to be false, etc. In this respect, it's my view is an error theory. That is, I accept that our phenomenology is intentionalistic. It assumes realism about intentionality. But this phenomenology is false. Okay? So this is about the psychological fact that in spite of arguments, we still believe, even if I myself in my reflective moments believe that there are intentional states. We think about things, we desire things, etc. I'm not sure this was your question. Was it? Is it a reply to? I'm not sure.
Sort of. Well, I was just sort of getting at. Look, it seems like your way to undermine the introspection or intuition as support for intentionality is kind of like a skeptical argument, right? And because look, you can have those introspections and intuitions even if there were no intentionality, and that the thought was that maybe someone wouldn't find that compelling as a reply because, well, you could say the same thing about other things, right? About other just facts about what's out there in the external world. I mean, our intuitions and introspections and so on are compatible with those things not existing, perhaps. But yeah, we're still motivated to believe in them on the basis of those, our feelings and otherwise internal states. Okay. So the thought might be, just because it's compatible with the non-existence of intentionalities, all the same, we're going to take it as some motivation for thinking there is intentionality.
Yeah,
I don't know if that was more clear, but maybe, yeah.
Now it's clear. Yeah. Well, that's true. I mean, that my case against the introspectability of intentionality does not settle the issue about there being intentional states. No, it's just an argument against one argument for intentional realism, we may say. But for this reason, I provide positive arguments against the very existence of intentionality, having nothing to do, or nothing directly at any rate, with introspection. That is, as I mentioned, one argument is that all options in logical space, the primitivist and the two kinds of reductive views, all of them don't work, and for this reason, the very notion of intentionality has no place. So I don't rely on arguments like the argument from introspection. It only meant to reject the appeal to introspection as an argument for the being. In the United States, I think it is not a good argument. And the same goes, I do both these things. I argue against arguments for intentionality. In other words, I rebuff objections to the intentional anti-realist view, and I provide positive arguments, which I've just mentioned. One, I have one or two more, say one or two because they are related. I have one argument that appeals to Occam's razor, for example, that intentionality, the assumption that there are intentional properties, you cannot justify assigning any role to it. It is not required for accounting for communication. It is not required for accounting for the success of content descriptions in predicting and explaining behavior of people. All possible things that you can attribute to intentionality, you can do without assuming that there are intentional states, intentional properties. And so in the final analysis, there is no sense in ascribing these properties to intentional states because the assumption that there are intentional semantical facts out there, objective semantical facts, it plays no role, and it plays no possible role. For this reason, I find in my view there is no place for these kinds of properties. One more sentence, perhaps it is clear, but to be on the safe side, because you mentioned skepticism. Well, the skepticism, the methodological skepticism of Descartes, for example, was that we should be skeptical about there being things in the external world. But what is immune of this skepticism were our mental states. And anti-realism goes a step further, of course. It says that even the existence of our mental states as we think they exist cannot be taken for granted and, in fact, should be rejected.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, I was thinking, like, even if you grant that, okay, maybe intuitions or introspections, maybe that could carry some weight in favor of realism, but it's not decisive, whereas it appears that you have decisive, arguments against, or at least very strong or much stronger arguments against realism. So, you could grant that maybe there's, we give some stock to these intuitions or whatever, but it's not strong enough. Maybe that's the thinking.
Yeah.
Maybe that's one way to go anyway. Okay. So I guess before we haven't talked about external theories like tracking theories yet, but I did want to ask a quick question about, more about methodology here while we're sort of on these issues. Because you talk a lot about as well, like experimental philosophy and research into like folk psychology and stuff like that. And how, so I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit. And what is the sort of significance of the empirical research when it comes to thinking about intentionality? Are there any maybe significant results that you found relevant here? Or maybe we just talk about empirical.
I think there are interesting results in experimental philosophy of language, of intentionality, reference, etc. Some of the findings even surprised me when I first read about them. Let's go to the classical writings about experimental philosophy of language, the surveys regarding Kripke's Gödel-Schmidt case. I will describe it very briefly. Kripke brought a few arguments against the descriptive theory of names, the Russellian theory. Kripke told us a story about the mathematician Gödel, who people who know about him know that he is the mathematician who proved the incompleteness theorem. And according to Kripke's story, it was not the case. The theorem was proved by a German mathematician named Schmidt. And if we adhere to this assumption that Schmidt was the mathematician who proved the theorem, then take the description, the mathematician who proved the theorem, it is true of Schmidt, not of Gödel. Now, if so, then if a name is the referent of a name, as Russell assumed, is determined by the description the speaker associates with the name, then if all the speaker knows about the person named Gödel is that he is the one who proved the theorem, then the name Gödel, according to descriptivism, refers to Schmidt, not to Gödel. But Kripke says this is absurd. Of course, the name Gödel refers to the person Gödel, not to Schmidt. And so the descriptive theory of names has a false prediction, we may say, and it is thereby refuted. Now, Maschery and Stitch and their colleagues, they put into an experimental test the idea that we have the intuition, the Kripkean intuition as it was referred to, that it is clear that the name Gödel refers to the person Gödel rather than to Schmidt. And they made a survey among American philosophy students, as far as I can remember, first, and the results were that most of them endorsed the Kripkean intuition. That is, that in the scenario described, Gödel refers to Gödel rather than to Schmidt. But then they asked the same question. They asked it Asian students, and the results were completely different. That is, most of the Asian people answered that in the circumstances described, the name Gödel refers to Schmidt rather than to Gödel. Now, what they took for it, Stitch, Maschery, and their colleagues, was that we cannot rely on our intuitions. Armchair philosophy of language has to be abandoned, etc. For me, these results, they are disputed, by the way, but I think there is an important grain of truth in them. What was surprising for me is that there was a cultural difference that obtained not only regarding axiological issues, for example, good and bad, religious views, etc. In this domain, it is quite expected that we find cultural differences. But regarding semantical matters, whether a term refers to this person or that person, that was surprising. And I think it is very important, but for me, this result was important also in some intuitive level, because if I ask myself, given this fact that the views of the Asians and the Westerners differ significantly, would I want to say that the Westerners' intuition is correct, whereas the Asians isn't, or the other way around? It doesn't matter. And there is a strong intuition that the answer is no, that it is not the case that the Westerners are right, and it is not the case that the Asians are right. And if so, this means that there is no right and wrong on this matter, on questions of reference and intentionality. And this is basically the idea of intentional anti-realism. And it was my experience. I mean, various people think that intentional anti-realism is a crazy view. I mean, if they are generous enough, they would say it's crazy. If not, they would say it's very stupid. But once they hear this story, it is easier to convince them that neither Asians nor Westerners are right. And once they accept this, the way for accepting intentional anti-realism becomes shorter. Okay, so this is one important lesson I take from the experimental philosophy enterprise. It's a big enterprise, and my basic view is a separatist view, that is, in which case experimental experiments of the sorts conducted by experimental philosophers, when they are relevant to the traditional philosophical questions, when they are not, I don't think there is a general answer. You have to check, to examine every specific domain and decide according to the specific characteristics of the domain. But intuitively, it supports, I think, intentional anti-realism, or at least makes it more plausible. And also, one of my arguments, the Occam's razor's argument, in a way relies on the very possibility, not of the existence of cultural divergence regarding semantic judgments, but on the very possibility. I try to argue that it leads to the idea that whether something referred to Gödel or to Schmitt is a difference that makes no difference. And for these reasons, the presumed fact that it refers to Gödel, say, isn't true independently of practice of content description. That it's not an objective fact that something refers to something.
Yeah, this is a very interesting stuff, and like, I'm not going to get too deep into this example or some of the stuff around it, but I wonder, like, I could see someone saying something like, "Look, yeah, this is a difficult puzzle to explain these divergences, and to figure out what the answer is regarding this particular name or names in general or referring terms, perhaps." But like, it's maybe a bit too quick to reject that there is a solution at all, because there's no reference in the first place, or there's no intentionality in the first place, because, well, that would just be maybe too radical of an option of the different possibilities. Yeah, so I guess that's a potential reply that someone might have, that, yeah, it's a difficult problem, but it's not clear that you've shown that anti-realism is the best response to that problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, again, that depends, of course, on the strength of my arguments. I presented the basic structure. As you mentioned, I haven't mentioned my arguments against the naturalistic reduction of intentionality. I can do it if you want, or we can go ahead as you feel.
Yeah, that's good. I was sorry if you want to say more, because I was going to turn to that next.
Yeah, okay. So I have two arguments against this idea. One of them is based upon an objection that was raised by others. I developed it regarding the idea of the indeterminacy of intentionality in naturalistic frameworks. There is indeterminacy in various senses, but one of them is that there are many mind-world relations, even with respect to every intentional state. It is related to various external objects, not one. There are various relations that candidates for being the intentional relation. And the question is, how do we decide which of them is the intentional relation? Or more precisely, what sense can be given to the claim that this causal relation, for example, is the intentional relation? There are a few answers to this. One of them, I'll focus on one, the answer of Michael Davitt, that according to it, well, let's take the reference relation and policy reference relation R1, which we assume is the intentional relation. What makes it the intentional relation? Well, according to David, this is simply how we use the word reference. I mean, this relation and no other is the one we call reference. Okay? And now, there are problems, I take it, with this idea. First of all, the intentionality, the concept of intentional relation seems to be neutral with respect to any specific, with respect to which specific causal, biological, etc. relation is the intentional relation. I mean, there is nothing in intentionality, in the concept of intentionality, that prefers, as it were, this causal relation rather than another. And another reason against this idea is that it actually leaves aboutness out. It leaves intentionality out, because saying this is what we call reference is vacuous. You can reply intentionality, this is intentionality, this is reference, you can replace it with any arbitrary combination of letters. This is intentionality, this is table, this is a reference, this is schmeference, etc. It makes no sense. That is, it is not really, it does not explain why is this reference the intentional relation, okay? Just using an arbitrary name with no substance. So, again, it leaves intentionality out and cannot solve the indeterminacy problem. That is, in a nutshell, one of my arguments against naturalistic reductions. I think I try to show that, again, all possible options to make sense of them fail.
Yeah, very, very good, very good. Sometimes I wonder about the indeterminacy worry. Like, if someone proposes some informational theory or whatever as an account of intentionality, like if you and they say, well, this is just the sort of relation that we're talking about. Well, I mean, it's not like a conceptual truth. I mean, when people employ intentional words, it's like, is that what they have in mind? Just like all the time, that it's some sort of informational relation like that. That doesn't seem obvious to me anyway. And so if it's not what they have in mind, then in what sense is it meant to be a conceptual truth? Or I guess we go back to the worry. Why is it that's the relation that ultimately we're expressing or picking out when we employ intentional language? So yeah, I guess that's just going back to the worry that you're discussing.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Although, what if we were trying to say something like, okay, there is a particular relation, maybe it's not super precise, but there's some sort of naturalistic reduction is correct. And it's not that we have it in mind. It's not some like analytic truth, if we want to use that sort of terminology, but we employ intentional language and content description and so on, and the appropriate account of what's underlying the descriptions, what we're kind of tracking, so to speak, in some way when we do that is, well, these sorts of other natural relations, be it something causal or informational or whatever. And that's something that maybe in principle we could discover. Maybe I'm not expressing it the best way, but like, I guess it's a sort of synthetic reduction. In this way, what do you think about that kind of approach broadly?
Yes. Look, this takes indeed the scientific model of reduction as the relevant model. Now, in the scientific case, let's go to the infamous water H2O example. For example, you take some macro properties, watery properties, the philosophers are fond of referring to them, and explain the watery properties, the macro properties in general in terms of some micro properties, the H2O properties. So in order to apply this model to the case of intentionality, you have to first identify these macro properties in the case of intentionality. And I don't think we can identify such a macro analog in the case of intentionality. If we reject phenomenal intentionality, it cannot be how intentionality is felt by us. If we take the macro properties to be logical relations, then logical relations cannot single out specific objects or specific relations to the world, because they are compatible with, for example, referring to one object as well as to its permutation and things like this. That is, you cannot get rid in this way from indeterminacy. And there are a few other possible candidates for being the macro analog of the watery properties, but neither of them seems to work. So the idea of synthetic reduction also doesn't work in the case of intentionality. I also think that defenders of this view cannot escape referring in some stage to a conceptual analytic element. For example, suppose we can single out some causal change that connects mental states with an object. But then the question arises, why to stop at this object and not stop at, I don't know, the light rays that this object emits and hit on our retina, for example? And I don't think there can be any good answer for this question apart from the answer that this is intentionality. Intentionality is a reference to this link of the causal chain rather than to this one. So the problem I mentioned with respect to the analytic reduction strikes again here.
Yeah. I think I see what you're saying. Now, someone could say, what if maybe what I'm about to say is not a realist theory, but maybe sort of along the lines of what I was saying. What if, there's the facts about our practices of content description and intentional language and so on. What if we discover, look, there's certain facts about what's going on in the world and in our head and so on that sort of underlies those descriptions. There's sort of conditions in which we count descriptions as being accurate or inaccurate and so on. And we can discover what those sort of facts that underlie that are. And, and in a sense, we can talk about those facts as being what fix intentional facts, so to speak. And we don't need to add anything more into that. And we can, I don't know if we want to call this a sort of reductive synthetic approach. What's so bad about that, I guess? Or is this not even, is this going to be not even a realist theory in the end? I don't know if I'm being clear in the proposal, but what do you think?
So let me try and then see if I understood you. Yeah, there are correlations between our descriptions of content and events in the world, and relations between our mental states and events in the world certainly are. This is a reflection of the simple fact that, first of all, we ascribe content, and our descriptions are sensitive, are responsive to various facts. That is, they are not completely arbitrary, etc. There is some systematization regarding them. But in order to be realist, you have to make a further step and say that these correlations constitute intentionality, and they did not be. I mean, you can come up with a theory about these correlations between the descriptions of intentional states and the relations between our mental states and happenings in the world. You can come up with such a theory, which is simply that. It is a theory of descriptions of content. And this involves no realistic admission. I mean, I admit that there are such correlations. It seems to me a trivial fact. It doesn't get close to showing that these correlations constitute real content, constitute intentional properties. And if my argument to the effect that indeed there cannot be such properties, then we did not take them. We did not take these correlations to form intentionality.
Right. Okay. I see what you're saying there. And maybe what I would say is what you would count as not a realist view, but like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, if it turned out that, and this is maybe more of an empirical matter, what we're really committing to when we employ intentional language and ascribe contents and so on, isn't any of these realist things. I mean, maybe just this is a practice we engage in. There are sort of conditions that we're sensitive to when we're looking to ascribe contents or employ intentional language in certain ways. And, we could say more about that, but that's kind of it. And we don't have to, in some robust sense, ascribe, what you might be talking about, these intentional properties or anything else like that we might reject for the reasons that you discussed, and maybe among others. And maybe that's enough. And maybe we don't need to. Maybe you want to call this an anti-realist view, or at least an irrealist view, but it's still not rejecting intentionality altogether. Maybe it's just taking a weaker view of what intentionality is supposed to be. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if intentionality is what is ascribed by content descriptions, in a sense it is true, but in the final analysis, I say that it captures nothing. I mean, content descriptions do not capture anything. This is not precise because content descriptions, according to my view, are also descriptions of logical syntactic structures. I mean, when you ascribe contentful state to one, again, you ascribe to one the belief that dogs are faster than cats, for example, you thereby ascribe to one a belief with a certain structure. And this element of description, the logical syntactic one, can be true. I mean, this is something that I don't deny. Not only that I don't deny it, I think there are good reasons to accept that, first, we have mental states, and second, that they have such structures. And for example, another objection to intentional anti-realism, to eliminate these views, another objection which I did not mention so far is the objection from the success of content descriptions, the explanatory and predictive success. That is, when we ascribe contents, beliefs, and desires in terms of content to our fellow subjects, for example, we, on many occasions, manage to predict their behavior and to explain their behavior. And people like Fodor, for example, took this fact to suggest that there's no good explanation for this success, which does not assume that there are intentional properties, that our mental states indeed instantiate intentionality. But I try to show that if we assume that mental states have logical-syntactic structures similar to those that we find in language, yes, we have all that is needed to explain this success. We don't have to assume intentional properties for this reason, for explaining this success.
Yeah, good. It's funny because the two things you brought up here were actually the two things I was going to ask about. So yeah. I mean, the talk about this thick logical syntactic structure. In the book, I think I recall you saying something to the effect of how they can be, our beliefs and so on can be true in a kind of coherentist or coherentist pragmatist sense. So does your approach here rely on that sort of approach to truth? Because I guess, maybe some deflationary or like what's wrong with the sort of deflationary or even the correspondence theory? Maybe a correspondence theory is going to assume a kind of intentionality, but
right.
But what about why would this be more required over, say, some sort of deflationary approach to truth?
Yeah. First of all, once you accept anti-realism, you cannot make any room for correspondence truth or representational truth. Yep. Right. Now, in the final analysis, I don't commit myself to a coherentist view of truth in the sense that true, as we used this word in language, is reducible to coherent relations or anything like this. Well, I play with this idea, but in the final analysis, I don't need this idea, because what I say is the following. First of all, our beliefs have logical syntactic structures. Second, since they have logical syntactic structures, we can make sense of their maintaining coherence relations amongst them. Now, maybe coherence gives us truth, maybe not. But the existence of such coherence relations is a good enough epistemic virtue. So it is such an epistemic virtue that can distinguish between good beliefs and bad beliefs. Moreover, it is precisely the same distinction that realists about intentionality, about correspondence truth, etc., appeal to, because the test for truth, even in the realist eyes, is, I think it is quite uncontroversial. The test, as opposed to the criterion for truth, the test for truth is coherence. So intentional anti-realism, in this sense, can say, yes, I distinguish between what you called true and what you call false in precisely the same way that you, the realist, do, and so I lose nothing. Okay? I can respect the pre-theoretical distinction that we appeal to regarding the quality, so to speak, of our beliefs.
Right. Okay. And then, as you said, well, one of the common motivations for realism is this view that, look, these intentional explanations, content descriptions, so on, seem very useful in explaining and predicting social interactions and so on. And perhaps it would be a sort of miracle that these theories would get things right in terms of their predictions, yet there be no intentional facts or properties. And I take it what you're saying now is that, look, we have this alternative, or maybe there's other alternatives, but here's at least one alternative that accommodates the data. We can we can explain why these predictions work without requiring any intentional properties or anything like that. That's the basic idea, I take it.
Yeah. This is related to the previous argument, the success argument. Yeah.
Right.
Not regarding the truth of our beliefs, but the truth of content description. That is, we don't need to assume the truth of content descriptions in order to explain their success in predicting and explaining behavior. Okay?
Right. So could you talk just a little bit more about how we get why isn't that required? So how do we get why are they successful? In other words, the predictions that were made.
They are they are successful because they have these logical syntactic structures, and logical syntactic structures are enough for there being reasoning, for example, for there being arguments and good arguments. There is a quite intuitive idea that we cannot explain action in terms of logical syntactic structures alone, that we must appeal to intentional properties as well, because actions are directed toward objects in the world. That is, I eat an apple. There is an object to my act of eating. And so it might seem natural to explain my eating the apple in terms of my desire to eat the apple. And this is why intentionality has to figure in this explanation of action. That is, I must assume, if I want to explain my eating the apple, I must introduce the intention to eat it, the desire to eat it, etc. But once we reflect on it, I think we can see that it is no explanation. I mean, because the relation between my eating and the thing I eat, the apple in this case, is not the intentional relation at all. Mm. My action does not represent the apple as my belief or desire is supposed to represent it. So, first of all, this putting intentionality in does not at all help. So I think we can do without it, but it's not only that we can do without assuming intentional properties. Assuming intentional properties does not help a bit.
Right. And as you say, we have other reasons to reject them anyway. So, yeah. Good. So just a couple more questions and we can wrap up. I guess sort of broadly, what are some of the major, if there are any, challenges you think your view faces that maybe, it might be difficult? And what are maybe some potential areas of future research or development that, you could see this area going, so to speak?
Yes. One issue is the issue of fictionalism. That is, fictionalism about mental states is the view that first denies there being intentional mental states. But more than this, according to fictionalism, we don't take our ascriptions of mentality to people to be true, but we use it as a metaphor, deliberately, in a sense. Now, this is not my view, because my view is is an error theory. That is, I say that our phenomenology is intentionalistic. Okay? Now, I think I didn't do enough in order to deal with the fictionalist challenge, which is not a challenge to my basic conviction that there are no intentional states, but to the idea that intentional anti-realism is an error theory. I think more has to be done in this regard. Another challenge that I think I met in my book, but I think it is an important one and should be mentioned, is that of the cognitive suicide charge. It is the idea that if intentional anti-realism is true, then this very idea cannot be expressed and cannot even be thought, because to express it presupposes intentionality, and to think of it presupposes intentionality. I try to handle with this idea, and I think basically when this objection is raised against my version of intentional anti-realism, it basically ignores the radical nature of intentional anti-realism, because in a way, I mean, the idea of this charge is that, well, so you claim that no one claims anything. This is a contradiction or so. But what I say is, no, I don't claim that there are no intentional properties. I don't claim that nobody thinks that so and so. Rather, I claim, and here I use some logical syntactic structure, I claim, quotation marks, there are no intentional properties. That is, I do not employ the intentional idioms. Nobody claims that so and so for any so and so, according to my view. So people like Paul Churchland, for example, they have trouble with accounting for the truth of our sentences if they when they adopt eliminativism, and they appeal to some futuristic idea that is, we'll find some way, an adequate replacement for truth. I say, no, we don't need, we already have it, because mental states, these states that are taken to be intentional, they have these logical syntactic structures, and these can account for truth, and they also can account for what I do with my view. I express it, but not as the view that. There are no such things as views that. On my view, views are logical syntactic structures. It is a little bit more complicated. There are patterns of such structures which cut across languages, etc. But basically, there are such structures. And so when I describe my own view, I don't describe it as the view that. I deny that there are such things as views that, claims that, belief that. I do have beliefs. My belief is there are no intentional states. My belief is not the belief that there are no such states. There are no such things in my approach.
Right. Although you're fine using some of the intentional idioms, just so long as it's not in a realist way, right?
Well, first of all, as I said, intentional anti-realism, in my version, is an error theory. And I also, like everybody else, I guess, I'm also a subject of this error. I cannot escape it in my non-reflective moods, and it would also be very difficult to express my views in a way that does not echoes the intentional realist way of speaking. But I don't deny that there are utilities for using the intentional idiom. And I adopt here the idea of deflationists about a truth which takes, it is true that to be a rhetorical device of some sort. So I believe that as a rhetorical device. We all do this. And as long as in my reflective moments I remember that it is only a rhetorical device, everything is fine. As I said, I don't recommend against using any alternative language, as long as we remember that the claim that, believe that language is not strictly true.
Right. Okay. Very good. I feel like there's a lot more that we could get into here, but we don't want to go on too long and leave some, there's a lot more detail in the book for people who are interested more in the sort of arguments and the issues that you raise. And it's very interesting stuff. I'll include links in the description here to where people can find the book on Amazon or from OUP and perhaps elsewhere. I do like to close with kind of more metaphilosophical question, if you don't mind. What do you think of as the value of philosophy? Why is philosophy worth doing, perhaps to you, or maybe more generally, or what do you think?
Well,
I know it's a big question, but
a difficult one.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, a separatist approach is adequate here. I mean, we should distinguish between practical philosophy and theoretical philosophy, first of all. Moral issues are very important. Moral philosophy is very important. Why is it important? It is important for moral reasons. As to theoretical philosophy, there is no general answer. I don't have a general answer here too, because various parts of theoretical philosophy differ from each other in this respect. Some philosophical ideas play the role in science, in the advancement of science. Some do not. I cannot be very specific about this here, but I just want to say that a basic motivation for doing philosophy is, I think, a thing that does not require justification. I mean, if you are interested in knowledge per se, that's great. I think knowledge per se is a great thing. It does not require explanation or justification in terms of practical utility. If people are only interested in practical utility, I guess, at any rate, theoretical philosophy is not the project for them to pursue. For me, it is. That's all in a nutshell, of course.
No, that's very good. Yeah, I mean, I definitely share a lot of that. So, yeah, I guess we can close the questions there. And thanks so much for being here, Professor Horowitz, and taking writing this book, first of all, and taking my questions and providing a very thoughtful responses. It's been great having you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.